I'm going to talk about Nick Land's work, and I'm going to talk about it in a way. I'm going to talk about it philosophically because I think that's, and explain why I want to talk about it philosophically, because I think that's a key to understanding, to maybe kind of understanding what its political ramifications might be. In other words, if you want to understand what the politics, if politics of accelerationism is possible, is feasible, then you need to understand I think you need to confront the internal conceptual intelligibility of the accelerationist program. All of us, several of us here kind of have been influenced by Land's work in one way or another. I once had a conversation with him where the conversation consisted, the disagreement with us was that he insisted that I kept translating what he took to be pragmatic issues of what he called machinic practice, into conceptual issues. In other words, he accused me of philosophical conservatism by insisting on translating what he took to be the pragmatic back into the kind of the theoretical. But I want to insist that this is necessary because there's, this machinic practicism that Land insisted on leads to a kind of practical impotence. Okay, so I want to insist that it's necessary to confront fundamental kind of conceptual issues before you can begin to understand what it is you're doing. Okay, and I think, and in that regard, I don't buy into the whole rhetoric about the need to kind of ditch representation. And I think if you try to ditch representation, get beyond conceptual representation, etc., I think you end up with a kind of you engender performative contradiction, not just theoretical contradiction, but performative contradiction. In other words, a contradiction at the level of concepts manifests itself in terms of an incapacity at the level of practice. Okay, so that's why I'm going to operate in this way, and I'm going to do it by schematizing, schematizing Nick's work or agenda in terms of three contrasts, three explicitly dialectical contrasts. And the point is that where a kind of machinic pragmatism insists on the need to kind of to resist and to obviate any kind of dialectical antagonism or opposition, I think it's necessary to do that in order to be able to kind of to identify what its strengths and weaknesses are. The 3 points I want to focus on, or the three kind of dyads, are critique and materialism, teleology and eschatology, and practicism and voluntarism. First of all, what makes, well, as Mark's already said, I think, I speak here as Robin Mackay and I are editing a volume of Land's writings called Found Noumena. These texts are pretty extraordinary, okay? And as Mark said, no matter how much one may detest, their kind of their rhetorical kind of animus, etc., it's simply kind of it's not enough simply to kind of to dismiss them as a kind of puerile, indulgent kind of hyper-Nietzscheanism. It's far more sophisticated than that, even if I do think it is ultimately kind of stymied by incoherences. And on any account, rereading those texts, I mean, these are extraordinary texts, okay? And they certainly, they're a kind of they provide a sobering contrast with the kind of the flaccid inanity of contemporary kind of Bergsonian vitalism. And the French philosopher Vincent Descamps once described Deleuze-Guattari, Deleuze-Guattari's Anti-Oedipus and Leotard's Libidinal Economy in terms of what he calls, as manifestations of what he called mad black Hegelianism. Okay, an attempt to kind of to find some kind of the prosecution of a kind of Marxist materialism that somehow would be kind of anti-Hegelian. In the same regard, like Land's work is a kind of mad black Deleuzianism. It's an attempt to kind of to turn Deleuze's the vitalist impetus, the affirmationist elan that kind of animates, you know, the Deleuze-Guattarian corpus, into something much more ostensibly kind of, you know, unsavory, but also actually much more conceptually invigorating. And it's the great. What's really interesting, as Mark said, is that there's a kind of, what's really interesting in these texts is the way in which there's a kind of extraordinary re-elaboration of negativity, okay, a kind of non-conceptual negativity, and the kind of these texts bristle with this kind of you know, sublimated fury, and that's what makes them kind of really powerful. And because I'm really interested in this issue about the power, and in fact, I want to try to show that it's possible to kind of to rehabilitate the powers of the negative against what Ben Noyes has called this kind of affirmationist consensus in contemporary theory. This is a moment in Land's work that I'm acutely interested in. Although I'll try to explain why I think he kind of he doesn't succeed in wresting the negative from a kind of from subordinating it to a kind of affirmation. Okay, these preliminaries aside, first of all, the Land sets out his, he's operating under the aegis of kind of Deleuze and Guattari's work. He proposes to radicalize critique, to convert the ideal conditioning of the representation of matter to the material conditioning of ideal representation. So that in the Landian kind of apparatus, matter becomes, materiality is construed solely as the production of production, okay? And transcendental materialism, which is to say Landianism in its kind of Landian kind of version, becomes a materialization of critique. The Kantian critique of metaphysics, of which there are kind of several versions, which is kind of you know, kind of supplemented in various kind of configurations of 20th century continental philosophy. This Kantian critique of metaphysics is converted into a metaphysics of critique, a materialist metaphysics of critique, by collapsing the hierarchy of the transcendental and the empirical. The first move, the really interesting move, and in fact the key to understanding the Deleuze-Guattarian concept of de-stratification in Landianism is that the first thing that needs to be de-stratified is the empirical transcendental difference, which is seen to be the enabling condition for critical philosophy. Okay? But what's interesting is that this is no longer a kind of Hegelian or dialectical sublation of this difference. It's kind of non-dialectical. It's a reduction of the difference to matter, because the Landian claim is that you can always understand how matter, thinking is a function of materiality, and representational thought, which is to say kind of conceptual categorization, and even on this account, even the logic of the dialectic itself is simply a kind of a circumscribed or depotentiated version of a kind of functional potency that is generated by matter itself. Okay. So the claim is that matter itself is synthetic and productive. Matter is primary process. Okay. Everything that unfolds at the level of conceptual representation is merely secondary and derivative. Okay. Synthesis is primary and productive, and all synthesis is the conjoining of heterogeneous terms. What Land proposed to retain from Kant was the emphasis on the transcendental efficacy of synthesis, the primacy of transcendental synthesis, but it's no longer the synthesis of empirical items, of objects of experience, anchored in a constituting subject. It's the synthesis, it's the autosynthesis, or the self-synthesizing potency of intensive, what he called intensive materiality, intensive matter. This becomes the key term in other words, it's a brilliant explicitation of the logic of the operation that Deleuze and Guattari carry out vis-à-vis Kantianism in Anti-Oedipus. The name of matter is nothing but kind of machinic production, self-differentiation, and all. And then the fundamental binary that organizes, I think, all of this materialist metaphysics, okay, is that between what he calls intensive materiality, which he identifies with the body without organs, and death. This moment of absolute indifference is absolute difference. Okay? And the link, it's also kind of, and Land is quite explicit about the link to a version of Schellingianism here. He explicitly links Deleuze and Guattari to Schelling. The binaries between what he calls zero, intensive zero as matter in itself, and every kind of conceptual binary between concepts and objects, or the representing and represented. Okay, so the claim is that by leveling this fundamental dualism, the dualism of transcendental form and empirical content, you get this materialist monism in which you explain how matter itself generates its own representation. It generates its own representation, and on this account, its own kind of illusory. The state representation itself is relegated to the status of a transcendental illusion. It's a misprision of primary processes at the level of merely secondary processes. But this materialist critique of transcendental critique, this is a materialist critique of transcendental critique, I think reproduces then the critical problem of the connection between thought and reality. Okay? Why? Because the problem then is, okay, if this, if you, how is it possible for you to, given that, how can you simply kind of circumvent representation and talk about matter itself as primary process, reality in itself? This process, which is obviously the problem that kind of underlies Kantian critique in the first place, is re-emerges in an exacerbated form in this materialist subversion of Kantianism. But the problem is particularly acute, and this is where Land's difference, the Landian elimination of the Bergsonian components in Deleuze's thought becomes awkward or generates a difficulty for him. Why? Because in many ways, you can align the Deleuzian critique of representation with the Bergsonian critique of representation. Okay, Bergson, much of what Deleuze says is problematic about the categories of representation. Representation is the kind of this mediating framework that kind of segments and kind of parcels out the world into kind of discrete, parcels out the flux of duration into discretely individuated objects. The claim is that you have an experience. There's a sub-representational layer of experience that it's possible to access. This is the kind of through intuition. In other words, the Bergsonian critique of metaphysics and the kind of the destitution or the kind of the sidelining of representation proceeds on the basis of the primacy of intuition. You can intuit the real differences in being. You can intuit the real nature of time duration in the Bergsonian register. Now, there's a problem here for Landianism because he can't do this. He's supplanted representation, okay, but he wants to supplant kind of this kind of Bergsonian kind of this the kind of vitalist phenomenology that kind of underlies Bergsonianism for a kind of unconscious thanatropism, okay. And the point is, how do you access the machinic unconscious? Okay, you can't get. It's not simply given. It's not simply given. And Lanz insists time and time again, nothing is given, everything is produced. Okay, so the problem is that Lanz kind of materialist kind of liquidation of representation also wants to kind of, because it doesn't want to kind of reaffirm the primacy of allegedly sub-representational experience, okay, which Bergson and phenomenology do in various ways. He has to explain what it is he's talking about, okay, when he's talking about, because he's doing a kind of materialist metaphysics, and there's an issue about what kind of traction this extraordinarily sophisticated conceptual apparatus can gain upon the process of primary, the real as intensive difference, primary production, matter in itself, whatever you want to call it. Okay. Now, this is an initial kind of philosophical difficulty, and it's a difficulty, okay, which interestingly, which Land himself tried to in conversation, tried to kind of dismiss by saying, well, you have to understand that it's no longer the key to understanding this is that thinking itself becomes no longer a question of kind of representational congruence between concepts and objects, between ideas and things, but it itself becomes a productive process. And the discussion of mapping, machinic mapping versus representational tracing in 1,000 Plateaus, in the opening Plateau rhizome is very important here. The claim is that Deleuze and Guattari claim that schizoanalysis, or rhizomatics, or whatever you want to call it, is itself a praxis. Okay, it's a doing. Okay, so therefore, and it's a doing through which in other words, there's a positive feedback loop between what you're talking about, what you're thinking about, and your thinking. Okay, so that your kind of conceptual practice, okay, is somehow it's no longer tracing kind of intelligible structures from an allegedly pre-existing or ready-made reality. It's actually tracing movements and tendencies in material processes. Okay. So it becomes self-legitimating in this sense. And then the question then becomes one of intensification. Okay, it's any kind of it's no longer a question of an epistemological question of the legitimacy or the validity of your theory vis-a-vis, in contrast to an allegedly kind of independent reality. It's simply about the extent to which your machinic practice, your schizoanalytical practice, kind of accentuates and intensifies primary production, or on the contrary, delays and inhibits it. So everything becomes converted. Instead of having kind of adequacy, truth and adequacy versus kind of falsity and inadequacy or misrepresentation, you have a question about whether what it is you're doing when you think is intensificatory or de-intensification. And this becomes the dyad that organizes all Land's work. It becomes about, and this is the key kind of conceptual trope that is then translated into a political register. In other words, it's because at the level of what it is you're doing as a kind of machinic materialist, it's about kind of intensifying primary production, that then this translates into a kind of a practical, all your practice is kind of governed by the imperative to intensify, accelerate, okay, and to ruthlessly demolish every obstacle, anything that threatens to kind of to delay or inhibit this. Now, I think there's a problem here, and the problem is this: is that the concept of intensity, okay, becomes fatally, equivocal here in this register. There's an equivocation between the Kantian talk about intensities at the level of appearances, and the Bergsonian talk about intensive difference as qualitative difference in the experience of duration. When Bergson is talking about intensity, he means precisely, intensive difference as a difference in quality that can never be mapped onto or correlated with any kind of magnitude or quantity. It can't be measured at the level of extensity. Okay? That's the difference between the intensive and the extensity. But this experience of intensity is correlated with, has a kind of phenomenological correlate. It's something you experience. You experience intensity. Okay? So, hence, vitalism is all about the intensification of experience and about having intense experience. But Landianism cannot avail itself of any kind of, this kind of register of intensification because he's not interested in phenomenological subjectivity, and he's not interested in experience insofar as it is, the experience of, a subject. Or in kind of the Deleuze-Guattarian kind of register of an organism that is, an organism with a face and a personal identity, etc., etc. These are all the things that are supposed to be, that require destratification. Okay, so my claim is simply that the claim that you can kind of you can dispense with the need for kind of any epistemological legitimation for your metaphysics by simply saying that it's not about truth or falsity, it's just about intensification. And the intensification of the primary process it's incoherence because matter itself, matter's primary production or death, okay, is not translatable into any register of affective experience or affective intensity. Okay. So this is why I find this account unconvincing, or this move unconvincing. The claim that you can just keep on intensifying and intensifying, and the second problem arises here, is that this is where a kind of affirmation or an imperative to affirm re-emerges, because the claim is that you must, in mapping kind of processes, movements of deterritorialization and partial reterritorialization, your mapping activity itself, because it is, it's nested upon the strata, it occupies an immanent position vis-a-vis these material processes. So you no longer have the transcendent exteriority between theory and world. Theory itself is implicated in the reality it's describing. Then the issue is, it becomes unclear. Okay, in other words, this is where there's a kind of the replacement or the substitution, okay, of a kind of sublimated materialist eschatology for all forms of rationalist teleology. Okay, the problem, in other words, the question is that the imperative to intensify is driven. It seems to be, why intensify? Why keep intensifying? Because there's always a surplus of stratification. You wouldn't need to intensify, deterritorialize, destratify, unless there was always a complement of reterritorialization and restratification. Okay? You only need to destratify because there's strata. Okay? So why is there stratification in the first place? Okay? This is because there's an organizing dualism here. In other words, the claim is that although the real itself is the absolutely deterritorialized, or the kind of the degree zero of absolute intensity, it's always differentiated and stratified, sedimented in various kind of complex ways. Okay? But then, once thinking itself becomes subordinated to the imperative to intensify and destratify, it's clear that there must be a point, a kind of a limitrophic point of absolute deterritorialization towards which the process of affirmation or acceleration tends. Okay, what is it that if you're accelerating? There's two things. One, there's material constraints upon your capacity to accelerate, but there's also there must be a transcendental speed limit at some point. Okay? And the ultimate speed limit is not a limit at all for Nick, it's death. It's cosmic schizophrenia. Okay? So that's the ultimate horizon. And here again, he's simply unabashedly endorsing this kind of remarkable thesis in Anti-Oedipus, but really stripping it from all its vaguely these kind of palliatives about how this might be this might generate new forms of creative existence, etc., etc. It's just at the end of the process is death, cosmic schizophrenia. Okay? Now, so there's a problem here, is that it's okay to the question is, practically, and the title of one of Nick's papers is called Making It with Death, okay? And it's a brilliant title, okay? So the claim is that because death is inherently productive, death is the motor, is the kind of the moment of anti-production that generates all production, the production of production, okay? The claim making it with death is not just that death is an innate, and this is where this is simply Freud, the beyond the pleasure principle. It's not just that life itself and that all vital differences are a unilateral deviation from intensive death. The claim is that you can have a moment of convergence with absolute intensity or absolute deterritorialization. What is this? Who would be the bearer? What vehicle, would continue to exist to be the bearer of this this thanatropic acceleration? Not the human species, certainly. Okay, the claim is that the claim is then that all terrestrial history is a history of intensification. Human social organization and the development of advanced technological capitalist society is merely a moment or a phase in this process. Okay. And the continuation of the process or the intensification of the process demands the elimination of humanity as this partial substrate, for the process. Now, the question is under what conditions? Now, here a fundamental contradiction. Well, I think a conceptual incoherence emerges in that. How can you intensify when there's no longer anything left to intensify? Okay, what's left to intensify? Okay, if your schizoanalytical practice is fueled by the need to always intensify, destratify, deterritorialize, okay, there comes a point at which once you yourself, there's no agency left. You've been dissolved back into the process, so that it's once secondary production has been reintegrated or feeds back into primary production, then ironically, what you have is this bizarre mimesis of the serpent of absolute knowledge, except this time it's the serpent of absolute production. But it's no longer. But the point is this: is that organically individuated human subjects, cannot position themselves vis-a-vis this circuit or this process, okay? Because the point is it's happening without you, it doesn't need you. It doesn't need you. So, and in fact the very concept of agency gets stripped out of this account. There's nothing, there's a quote, I won't find it. There's a quote which says, it's happening anyway and there's nothing you can do about it. Okay? The key claim is that you are being, something is working through you, okay? There's nothing you can do about it, so you might as well kind of, fuse. And obviously, and this is where there's a kind of the retention, and this is not a kind of, this is a philosophical problem. The philosophical problem is that there's the retention of this kind of romantic, kind of Schopenhauerian kind of moments of, kind of a fusion between the personal and the impersonal, okay, between the individuated subject and the cosmic schizophrenia, the impersonal kind of primary process. But it's still, for Schopenhauer, that it still makes sense to postulate that because it's still something. The point where the will turns against itself is a moment that governs the whole of kind of Schopenhauer's kind of ethical, ethical and practical philosophy. Okay, but with Land, the problem is that no longer the point is that you no longer have any kind of fulcrum for the point of reversion. Okay, for the point of conversion from secondary process back into primary process, because the whole point is that there are no individuated bearers left anymore. And secondly, this convergence doesn't unfold at the level of experience. Okay, it simply doesn't unfold at the level of experience, and in that regard, the whole kind of vocabulary of intensification and disintensification becomes redundant. Okay, so and the paradox is simply this: is that under what conditions could you will the impossibility of willing? Okay. How could you affirm that which incapacitates all affirmation? Okay. This is a conceptual problem, but it has interesting, I think, practical and political consequences, okay? Because Nick became ever more, and it has a political valence, I think, because I think it explains Nick's kind of political trajectory from a kind of radical kind of ultra-left anarchism, from a point when, in a paper called Can Capital and the Prohibition of Incest, a polemical introduction to the configuration of philosophy and modernity, he says, the state apparatus of an advanced industrial society can certainly not be defeated without a willingness to escalate the cycle of violence without limits. Okay? And he says, and interestingly in this paper, it's radical militant guerrilla lesbian feminists who are the only kind of revolutionary subjects. He moves from this moment where he's perfectly willing to kind of endorse or affirm, kind of radical. He thinks kind of his critique of kind of the Marxist left is that it's not radical enough, not revolutionary enough, not critical enough. Okay. This moment, and then 5 or 6 years later, he comes to a point where he realizes that, or he seems to realize that there is no bearer of revolutionary intensification left, and therefore politics must be displaced, or it must be kind of deputized, and all you can do then is endorse or affirm those impersonal processes that are going on, that at least harbor the promise of generating or ushering in the next phase of deterritorialization. What does this mean? It means affirming free markets, deregulation, the capitalist desecration of traditional forms of social organization, etc., etc. Why? But not in the name of not because he thinks it's promoting individual democracy and freedom. Okay? So he has to instrumentalize neoliberalism in the name of something that is, allegedly kind of far more, far darker and more potentially kind of corrosive. But in the process, it seems that you end up. It's like, if your enemy's enemy is your friend, the dangerous point is when you forget what it was, the conditions under which you made this strategic alliance. Okay, and the reason is because you can no longer see. It's no longer possible to identify the goal anymore. So you end up endorsing. In fact, you end up embracing a kind of neoliberal politics, neoliberal ideology, and the pretense of kind of instrumental distance, the claim that this could be a kind of a cunning of a schizophrenic reason in some sense, quickly evaporates. Quickly evaporates because it's not possible to dissociate praxis from identifiable ends anymore. In other words, once you dissociate, there's a famous kind of this distinction between tactics and strategy. Strategy is teleological, transcendent, representational. Tactics is immanent, machinic, etc., etc. But if you don't have any strategy, all the tactics you deploy are ultimately always going to be co-opted by some kind of implicit. Someone with a strategy will soon commandeer your tactics. Okay? In other words, even if you think you're someone who knows what they want and who knows what they want to realize, will start using you. In other words, so you become a pawn of another kind of impersonal force, but it's no longer the glamorous and seductive impersonal force that you hoped to make a compact with. It's a much more kind of cynical, kind of libertarian capitalism. I should stop.
Okay, just